It's kind of remarkable, but the first serious document we have from Abraham Lincoln actually comes from 1832, when he was 23 years old. And it's a political document. We have nothing else really before that except a few minor things copied in school books. We have no letters, no diaries, nothing by his own pen. This first campaign statement from March 9th, 1832, is the first real document where we hear Lincoln's voice as a young man. And it's an extraordinary thing. He is announcing himself as a candidate for the state legislature of Illinois in a handbill that he prints for the people of Sangamo County, and it's published in the local newspaper, the Sangamo Journal. He writes, "Fellow citizens, having become a candidate for the honorable office of one of your representatives in the next General Assembly of this state, in accordance with established custom and the principles of true republicanism, it becomes my duty to make known to you, the people whom I propose to represent, my sentiments with regard to local affairs." But there's something that you need to know about that opening that's not clear from the way Lincoln writes it. It was not really an established custom, and it wasn't in accord with what most people then called the principles of true republicanism for a candidate for the state legislature to publish a policy statement outlining his sentiments on affairs. That was something at the time that some candidates for higher offices were doing, but Lincoln is running for this office in a field of 13 people, and he's the first one to do it. And more than that, out of this field of 13 people, he is exceptional. He's the youngest. He's the only one who's been living there for less than a year. He is the least well-known, the least educated. Up until this point in his life, Lincoln has only had about a year of formal schooling. He was raised to farm work, he said. And now here he is at the age of 23, basically employed as a clerk in a store, offering himself for statewide office or for office in the state legislature, with a very expansive, almost ambitious policy platform. And the policy platform is all about rivers. He says here, "Time and experience have verified to a demonstration the public utility of internal improvements." Now that phrase, internal improvements, is a key word, a key phrase. It is something that refers to transportation projects. It's a 19th century phrase that is all about the constructions of roads, canals, improvements to rivers and harbors, everything designed to make it easier to move goods and people from one place to the other. The people in the 19th century who wanted to see the economy grow fastest, who wanted to invest in the future of the republic, were the ones who were the strongest advocates for internal improvements. Later, the parties would divide over the question of internal improvements, with the Whigs emerging as the strongest advocates for internal improvements, and the Democrats being more reluctant to invest government money in internal improvements. But at this stage, that wasn't entirely clear yet. Lincoln goes on to describe why these things are good, but he notes that some internal improvements, like railroads, are very expensive, and that it would be safer to think about rivers and improving them as the surest way to make progress for the economy. And he writes here that the probable cost of a contemplated railroad is estimated at $290,000. He says here, "The bare statement of which, in my opinion, is sufficient to justify, it's enough to justify the belief that the improvement of the Sangamo River is an object much better suited to our infant resources." And then he goes on to try to position himself as the leading expert on waterways improvements. He says, "For my peculiar circumstances, it is probable that for the last 12 months I have given as particular attention to the stage of the water in this river as any other person in the country." And there is an awful lot of detail here that he provides that demonstrates how much experience and knowledge he had about the river, and how he had a plan for straightening its channels in order to make it easier for steamboats to pursue their navigation during a longer period of the year in order to make it cheaper to move product to market. And then he moved on to other issues. And he reveals some interesting values and strategic insights here. Lincoln writes, "It appears that the practice of loaning money at exorbitant rates of interest has already been opened as a field for discussion." That wasn't in the papers, but perhaps it was something people were discussing. So he says, "So I suppose I may enter upon it. And he writes, "It seems as though we are never to have an end to this baneful and corroding system, acting almost as prejudicial to the general interests of the community as a direct tax of several $1,000s. And therefore, he proposed that a law for the purpose of limiting the rates of usury, or exorbitant rates of lending money, should be made without materially injuring any class of people." But then he says something kind of remarkable. He writes, "In cases of extreme necessity, there could always be means found to cheat the law, while in other cases it would have its intended effect." This is not exactly what you expect to hear from a young would-be legislator, but it demonstrates how sophisticated Lincoln was as a young policy wonk, or as a young politico. He was deft in trying to maneuver between the extremes. He turns to other issues, like education. And he says here something that should warm the hearts of anybody who cares about education. He says, "Upon the subject of education, not presuming to dictate any plan or system respecting it, I can only say that I view it as the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged in." He writes that every man may receive at least a moderate education, and thereby be enabled to read the histories of his own and other countries, by which he may duly appreciate the value of our free institutions, appears to be an object of vital importance, even on this account alone, to say nothing of the advantages and satisfactions to be derived from being able to read the Scriptures and other works both of religious and moral nature. Now, later in Lincoln's career, he will face all kinds of charges that he wasn't religious enough, and you might see the beginnings of this problem in the way he favors national history and patriotism over religious faith and moral instruction. He includes them both, but clearly he favors one over the other, or at least you might interpret it that way. It's also true that even though he says education is the most important subject, he's not dictating any plan or system. Now, you don't have to know too much about politics to realize that what he's done there, in other words, is he said something's important without putting a price tag on it. And in fact, the reason why education was a topic of discussion in Illinois is because people had debated how much money the government should invest in different types of public schools and in institutions of higher education. And different plans that had been launched a decade before in Illinois had been abandoned recently because they were too expensive. Lincoln is saying that education is important, but he's not committing himself to raise tax dollars to pay for it. He kind of evades the issue. He concludes by saying that considering the great degree of modesty which should always attend youth, it is probable I have always been more presuming than becomes me. However, upon the subject to which I have treated, I have spoken as I thought. And I may be wrong in regard to any or all of them, but holding it as a sound maxim that it's better to be only sometimes right than at all times wrong, so soon as I discover my opinions to be erroneous, I shall be ready to announce them. That's also a construction he would use later in his career. He then closes his document by offering a kind of reflection on himself. He says, "Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can only say for one that I have no other so great as being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. How far I shall succeed in gratifying this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young and unknown to many of you," he writes. "I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend me." And then he says, "My case is thrown exclusively upon the independent voters of this county, and if elected, they will have conferred a favor upon me, for which I shall be unremitting in my labors to compensate. But if the good people in their wisdom shall see fit to keep me in the background, I've been too familiar with disappointments to be very much chagrined." Now, there's a lot going on there that you might not see right away. Lincoln is acknowledging that he has no wealthy or popular recommendations to recommend him, that he is in effect an independent candidate for independent voters. The argument he's making for them is that he supports policy positions that will benefit them, and that he will labor to implement those policies. This is a forward-thinking politician. He's moving beyond the days of the early republic, where candidates stood for office and relied on their reputation in the community and their honor to lead them into public office. He's running for office on a policy platform that's very particular and represents a departure from the past and a look toward the future. 1832, they did not yet have organized mass political parties in Illinois. There was no Democratic Party and no Whig Party. They were coming together in the country, but they hadn't yet reached Sangamo County in 1832 at the level of state representative. Lincoln is prepared for that shift, and he's working toward it. And he will later help lead other shifts that will create new parties, like the Republicans in the 1850s. And you can see how important it is to him that political parties exist to help people lift themselves up, like him, and like others who are living in his region of Illinois.